Hello, my name is Candice Roberts, and this is my translational project, Guided Meditation for Burnout in Psychiatric Caregivers. So what is burnout? Well, I want you to imagine a candle like the one you see here. And you can see that there is one candle where the light is getting really low. The wax is getting ready to overtake it. Maybe there's a little wind blowing on it. But it's getting ready to lose its light, and therefore it's getting ready to lose its usefulness. So this is what happens when a candle burns out. And now I want you to imagine a psychiatric caregiver, so a psychiatric nurse or a tech or CNA. And imagine them burning out. What does that look like? So first it looks like emotional exhaustion, which is emotional drainage coupled with a lack of emotional resources to deal with that drainage. Secondly, it looks like compassion fatigue. The caregiver hears these traumatic stories of the patients over and over, and there's an emotional labor attached to that where they have to be present with that patient, but they hear the same stories over and over and they become desensitized to it. There's an element of stress in burnout, particularly perceived stress. So it's not really the event, but how the caregiver views the event, that affects them. And then burnout also entails self-coldness, which is the opposite of self-compassion. So instead of feeling kindness towards myself and patient with myself, I'm very harsh and judgmental with myself. And so that is what burnout looks like in a psychiatric caregiver. They're exhausted. They don't have any more capacity for compassion for their patients or themselves. They're stressed to the max, and they lose their usefulness. So what causes burnout? Well, much like this picture here of the wind and the rain, there can be many causes of burnout in a person. There can be workplace violence. So in one study of over 600 nurses, 40% had experienced workplace violence in the last year. And in another study, 83% of psychiatric caregivers experienced verbal aggression. Then there's the demands of the job, which have always been heavy, but are getting more heavy with higher patient ratios. Sometimes staff are taking care of 8 patients. The techs are taking care of up to 15. They have more responsibilities. They have to lead groups. And then they have more medical patients too. So our patients are becoming sicker. They're no longer just there for psychiatric needs. They now have all these medical needs on top of it. So it's a more demanding job. And of course, nurses and techs are human, so they bring their personal stress into work too, everything they've got going on at home. And then a lack of validation by management or by executive leadership. They're not told that they're doing a good job. They're only told what they're doing wrong. And certainly there is a lack of control. So our caregivers have very little say, if any, over their wages, their hours, the staffing ratios, their responsibilities. They don't have time for patients, and that's out of their control. So all of these things can be causes of burnout. The effects of burnout are pretty serious. First of all, you get a high turnover. In a study of 3,000 hospitals in 2019, the rate of turnover was 17.8%. But if you just looked at psychiatric caregivers, the rate was 20.6%. And this, of course, is before COVID, and we know that has increased exponentially. And when there's high turnover, there's staff shortages. It's kind of a vicious cycle, and that increases the burnout, and then more people leave, and it's just this cycle. But ultimately, what happens is that safety is compromised. There are more workplace violence incidents now for our caregivers, but the safety of patients is also compromised because we don't have enough staff to care for them, to assure their safety. And there's also a lack of experienced caregivers who know what to look for, who know the safety risks, who can better prepare for them. So it's this vicious circle that ends in safety being compromised. So in this study, I wanted to use guided meditation as a treatment for burnout. Guided meditation does have Buddhist underpinnings. It is known to decrease distress. That includes anxiety, depression, and feeling of being out of control. It is known to increase compassion for others, which is the sympathetic consciousness of another's distress. And of course, it increases self-compassion too. The MBSR, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, is an 8-week course that has been studied extensively and has really good results. That's not practical to do for a translational project, but it's also not practical for most nursing staff because they have to find the time to do this 8-week course, and it's quite expensive, so they have to find the money. But what research shows is that even small bits of mindfulness or meditation that can be given over a smartphone app have shown positive results. Those smartphone apps for meditation also decrease distress and increase compassion. So the PICO question for this translational project is, will psychiatric caregivers who use a mindfulness meditation app for 4 weeks have lower rates of burnout than they did before the intervention? So this is a quantitative design, which means there's actual number data. So it's not just someone telling us how they feel. We were actually able to quantify it. It's a pre-post test design. So the participants will take tests before the intervention. Then they have the month-long meditation intervention, and then they take the same tests after. So the pre-test and the post-test, and those are compared. We have used 4 validated scales to measure the symptoms of burnout, and then a paired t-test to analyze the data. The validated scales are as follows. I use the Maslow Burnout Inventory, which does measure emotional exhaustion. It was first developed to use with human service workers like social workers, but it has since been used with medical professionals and validated there. The Professional Quality of Life Scale measures compassion fatigue. The Perceived Stress Scale is pretty intuitive. It measures the participants' perceived stress. And then the NEF Self-Compassion Scale measures that self-compassion we were talking about. This is also a Buddhist concept. This particular scale has 6 subscales. There's the positive subscales, self-kindness, a feeling of common humanity, mindfulness, and then there's the negative subscales, which are self-judgment, isolation, and an over-identification with feelings. So for this design, I first had to get IRB, Institutional Review Board approval from both Maryville University and the larger hospital system for the hospital that I'm doing the project at, or I did the project at. We recruited participants in our daily staff huddles before each shift, as well as through staff emails. Participants had to sign a consent form if they wanted to participate, and then they filled out the 4 initial questionnaires. They also were to download the Insight Timer app, which is a free app on the phone. It has over 10,000 guided meditations, and you can look them up by content or category or by time. Like there's 5-minute ones, there's 10-minute ones, there's longer ones as well. And then I did set up a meditation corner in our break room that had soft lighting, was very quiet. It had a reclining chair, and it had the headphones for the participants to use. The intervention itself was very straightforward. It lasted 4 weeks. Participants had 10 minutes each shift to go sit in the meditation corner and find a meditation on the Insight Timer app and follow along. That was all they had to do. So each 12-hour shift for the month, they would get a 10-minute break in addition to their lunch break to go do this. When the month was over, the participants filled out the post questionnaires, which were the exact same as the pre-questionnaires. There was an Amazon drawing done for those who turned in their consent form, and I gave away 2 $50 Amazon gift cards. And then a paired t-test analyzed the pre- and post-questionnaire data. Inclusion criteria for participants. They had to be between 18 and 70 years old. They had to have a high school diploma or GED. They had to have a current license, so that would be a CNA or a paramedic license for the techs, and then an RN license for the nurses. They had to be part-time, which was 2 12-hour shifts a week, or full-time, 3 12-hour shifts a week. And they had to sign the consent form. Exclusion criteria, and if they were over 70, obviously if they were under 18, but our company doesn't hire anyone under 18. If they didn't have a high school diploma or a GED, if their license was expired, if they were just a PRN employee, so those work either 1 shift a week or 1 shift every couple weeks, then they couldn't participate. And if they didn't want to sign the consent form, they could not participate. So as with any research study, it's very important to protect human subjects. There's not a lot of risks with this particular project. The biggest risk was of emotional distress. So some of the questions may have been uncomfortable for the participant to answer, or they may have felt distressed sitting quietly for 10 minutes or distressed by the content of the meditation. So we told the participants they didn't have to answer any questions they didn't want to, and they could leave a meditation early. They didn't have to finish it. Confidentiality breach is always a risk with research using human subjects. We did our best to prevent this. The pre and post intervention questionnaires, those 4 validated skills, they were coded to match each other, but they had no place for the participant's name. There was no identifiable information on them. We did recognize that these employees were a vulnerable population, and we made sure that they didn't feel like their job was in danger or that there would be a lack of promotability if they did participate or if they did not participate. So for data analysis, we were able to use a paired t-test. Typically, you need 41 or more subjects to use this test. We considered the Wilcoxon ranked pairs test. I would have needed 6 to 40 participants. The caveat is you can use the paired t-test with less than 41 participants if the data meets the normality assumption. And so I was very fortunate. I only had 9 participants, but the data met the normality assumption, so I was able to use the paired t-test. So that's what I did. Just a little demographic statistics for you. Participants by job title. 67% of those participating were techs, so they were either CNAs or paramedics, and 33% were RNs. Participants by years in healthcare. So the majority had under 5 years healthcare experience. 40% had over 5 years, and 13% had over 15 years. And this makes sense because the majority of our population our caregiver population at the hospital are new grads, or they haven't been in healthcare for very long. Sometimes psych is their first job because they just want to get their foot in the door into the hospital. This sort of matches the age of the participants as well. So well over 50% were under the age of 30, 27% were over 30, and 20% were over 50. After we analyzed all the data, of course, we wanted to have a p-value that told us whether the results were statistically significant or not. So hopefully you'll remember that for a value to be statistically significant, it should be less than or equal to 0.05. So that was the magic number we were looking for, 0.05. Emotional exhaustion did not reach it. It was 0.192. Compassion fatigue did not reach that. It was 0.068. Perceived stress did not reach it. It was 0.061. But self-compassion did reach this statistically significant level. The p-value was 0.0065. So what that tells us is the mindfulness or the guided meditation intervention statistically improved self-compassion in the participants. These other three parts of burnout were not improved, but self-compassion was improved. The strengths to the project include the 4 measures of burnout. It gives us a fuller picture of what burnout is. It gives us different aspects of burnout to measure. For instance, if I had just used the Maslow burnout inventory, I'm going to go back, that would have measured emotional exhaustion. I would have not seen any improvements, but because I used 4 different scales, I was able to see improvements in self-compassion. The pre and post test design is also a strength. It allowed us to quantify responses to a guided meditation intervention, and that we were able to use a paired t-test was also a happy accident and a great strength of the project, because it does have greater statistical power than the Wilcoxon ranked pairs test. Of course, there are some limitations to the project. The first one being a small sample size. I told you I had a sample size of 9. Originally, there were 15 participants, and even that is a small sample size, but we lost 6 because they did not fill out the second set of questionnaires. Also, the lack of monitoring is a limitation. The caregivers were told to do this 10-minute meditation during their shift. That was not monitored. They could have not done it at all. They could have only done it for a few minutes. They could have been distracted while doing it. They could have done a long meditation. I just have no idea, other than they were told to do it and they agreed to do it. Also, there's a voluntary response bias. So these participants all volunteered to take part in the project. So they weren't like randomly assigned or randomly chosen. And maybe they volunteered because they believe in guided meditation. Maybe they volunteered because they're feeling really burned out and they wanted help. Or maybe they volunteered because they were feeling totally carefree and wanted something fun to do. We just have no idea the reasons why people volunteered to be part of this study, but it could have affected the results. And finally, a barrier to the project was the staffing shortages that we're still facing, because I did hear some nurses and techs say, well, we would participate, but we don't think we can make the time during the shift to do that. We're already, so slammed all day long. So I know we would have gotten more participants if we didn't have such staffing shortages. There are opportunities for future research, including repeating the study but addressing the limitations. So trying to get more people to sign up. You could even do it for a longer period of time, like maybe 3 months instead of 1 month. And you could definitely have some monitoring of the guided meditation. That would require more research staff, but it could be done. Other research might include finding different causes of burnout within the hospital, and then finding other treatments for burnout, because this is obviously a serious problem in our psychiatric caregivers. So in conclusion, this was a project aimed at psychiatric caregivers, nurses, and techs, and it aimed to understand their burnout and also to help alleviate it through guided meditation via a smartphone app. So just a 10-minute guided meditation. We used 4 validated scales to measure their burnout both before and after the intervention. And what we did find was guided meditation led to a statistically significant increase in self-compassion for these psychiatric caregivers. Thank you so much for your time.